I really want to focus in on this session on the ways in which we use the data, the ways in which we see the data, the schemes in which this data comes into play, how we as admissions tutors evaluate this data and sort of, you know, basically the role it has as part of our processes. And just to emphasize this, it is something we take really, really seriously. So you can see here that you'll probably see this slide again in other people's presentations as well, but we do have a lot of information to draw on, and it all goes into the pot. We're using all of it all of the time through our processes to try to work out who are going to be the students who will come to Cambridge and thrive. And that's really the key thing for us. So we know that particularly in the UK, we are working with very, very unequal playing fields in terms of academic provision in schools, in terms of access to educational and other opportunities. And that's something that we want to make sure that we factor into our decision making. But I do want to say right from the start that what none of us are in the business of doing is setting people up to fail. So we will never take a student onto a course simply because we feel sorry for them, because they've had a horrid time, because life's been unfair, if we don't think that person will come to Cambridge and do really well and thrive and get the most out of the educational that is on offer here. So, you know, we are in the business of using this contextual data to make good decisions, and a good decision is one that works for the student involved. You know, coming to Cambridge has to make their life better and not worse. And the academic pressure of this environment means that if they are not suited to the course that they're applying for, sometimes admitting them is a cruel thing to do and not a kind thing. So that's the sort of overall framing for this. But, you know, we are, as you'll hear in other sessions as well, we are interested in assessing academically, and it's about suitability for the course that they're applying for. So I thought the most useful thing would be to take you through the different sorts of contextual data that we use and explain how it feeds in at certain points. Obviously, this is the admissions process. Again, you'll probably see this slide again, but obviously there's a sort of a run up to this, and there are places where the contextual information can be fed in. So one of the key things is at the UCAS application stage. Obviously, as part of that, the students themselves declare information about themselves. And some of that information relates to things like home postcodes. And as you'll see in a subsequent slide, home postcode will trigger some of our contextual flags. So it is really important that they use a home postcode, a real home postcode. You know, every year we see the occasional application that for various reasons comes through as a post office mailbox, for example, and that's what we don't want. We do want a postcode that reflects a real home environment. I think at UCAS they can declare the real home postcode and a correspondence address. So for those students who have, for example, very unstable backgrounds, it is worth noting with them, or kind of reminding them that they can actually use both addresses. But it is important that we do have the series of flags triggered from the real postcode and not perhaps one that they're willing to have post sent to. So that's one place that we can pick up some of this contextual information. You, of course, in your teacher references can give us other sorts of information as well that we may not pick up through any other aspects. So while at UCAS, they are asked if they have any care experience. So either are they a care leaver or have they spent time in local authority care? There isn't a question there, for example, about estrangement necessarily, or about you know, shorter spells of family disruption. So that is something that you can put, with their permission, obviously, into your reference for them. You can flag to us that there might be those sorts of contextual factors to take into account, or you can use our extenuating circumstances form. So that's where there's been serious disruption to life or educational health, and that then sits alongside the application and means we essentially have a narrative account of what's gone badly wrong. So I'll come on to a little bit more detail in all of those in a minute. So basically we pick up some of the flags from the UCAS application. We then do quite a lot of work with the information on the UCAS form that triggers things like school related flags. And on the additional questionnaire, we also have our question about eligibility for free school meals. Now we are getting that information sort of direct from government, but it's not perfect. So we are still asking our own question, and it's quite then interesting to compare those two data sets. But just to reassure you that this contextual information gets taken into account at all stages of the process, both at decisions about whether to interview and then any arrangements for the interview itself. Sometimes there will be, for example, disabilities that we need to take into account when interviewing, or when people are being registered for tests. And then, of course, when we're making the decisions in January, it's still all being taken into account at that point. So we get the applications in, we get all the data coming to us through the UCAS system, and then our central Cambridge Admissions Office compiles the contextual data where it is available and then distributes it out through our electronic system. Anyone who's made an open application is allocated to a college at that stage, and that is a random allocation. So those students making an open application essentially are handing over control of the process to the algorithm. They can't then come back after the college has been allocated to say, oh, but I didn't want that one. So if you are advising students who are thinking about making open applications, that's absolutely fine. It's perfectly sensible. They're allocated to a college that's slightly undersubscribed for that subject, but there is no kind of human agency here. So they are essentially handing over their agency to the algorithm. They can't come back and complain about it. So if you've got, sorry, could you put on mute? I can hear coughing and a bit of rustling. Once we've got all the applications in, we've got the applications disseminated out to colleges, we've got the contextual data flags disseminated out to colleges, and then for those remaining subjects that have pre-interview assessments, we add in the test scores where those are available, and that's the point at which the interview shortlisting can take place. So just to give you a sense, I've borrowed this screen from Oxford. This is a snapshot of their computer system, but I'll concentrate on the next one, which is our Cambridge one. And it's quite helpful to use this to talk through the data that we have on each of our applicants and the way in which we might start to use this. So this would be a screenshot of data as it's downloaded from our central system. And so what you can see here is information on obviously year of application. These are real people, but I've obviously blurred out their UCAS PIDs. But these are the flags that I think you're probably going to be most interested in. So the in-care flag is self-declared at UCAS. So if they have spent time in local authority care, they should be indicating that. Free school meals, this flag is generated from the question on our additional information form, which from this year forward it's a platform called My Cambridge Application. So whereas you might be familiar with the concept of the SAQ, the Supplementary Application Questionnaire, from this cycle and onwards, it's a nice new whizzy platform that looks much more beautiful than the SAQ ever did. Similar sorts of questions though, and so that's where our question about free school meal is indicated. So obviously, if you are aware that your student is entitled to free school meals, that's something that's quite useful to put into your reference as well, because although, as I say, UCAS are now providing free school meal data, it's only that data that's hosted in the National Pupil Database. It doesn't, for example, cover students who are independent schools on bursaries who are eligible for free school meals but not actually in receipt of them. People might be missing from that system. So it is a question that we still ask, and then we verify it later against the data that's provided by UCAS. We have indications here of what polar quintile people's home postcode is in, and so these next three flags, the polar 4, the OAC and the IMD flags, they all run off somebody's home postcode, and you can see that often these will cluster together. They're sort of complementary sets of data really. So that's why it's particularly important to have a home postcode declared at UCAS that does accurately reflect the home living environment. So it's sometimes worth seeking some advice, as I say, for those students who come from very, very unstable home environments and who might have moved around a lot. So someone perhaps whose home postcode doesn't reflect their actual environment is someone who you should really think about putting an extenuating circumstances form in for, just so we capture that. So polar is the indication of low participation neighbourhoods. So a flag of 1 means that someone is in the bottom 20% of postcodes for progression onto higher education of any form. 2 means they're in the next 20%. So you can see that being given there. Some people won't have that, so particularly overseas students, but also people who are perhaps expatriates, so might have home fee status but live outside of the UK. So that's not always populated. Similarly, OAC is a socioeconomic classification, output area classification, and is similar to IMD, which is the indices of multiple deprivation, but draws on a slightly different data set and slightly different measures. So sometimes you can have one and not the other, and sometimes they're complementary. So those are our home postcode flags, the 3 of them. We then have a couple of school-based flags. So we have an indication of where someone has attended a lower performing GCSE school, which is where the school average GCSE point score is less than 40. So you can see, for example, here, someone's got 38.6, and yes, they were at a lower performing GCSE school. So that enables us to get a sense of where particularly those people who have moved schools at sixth form, you know, someone with a really strong GCSE profile from a really weak GCSE school is actually a really, really good bet, and enables us to sort of weigh those things up. We also have a flag that indicates if someone's at a sixth form level, so year 12 and 13 level, in a setting that doesn't send many people successfully to Oxford and Cambridge. And again, that's quite a useful indicator for us. And then we have an indication of whether they have submitted the extenuating circumstances form, and that just warns us to look out for it. So it doesn't sort of automatically give eligibility for something, but often it gives us an indication that there are things that we need to be aware of and that we need to take into account here. So we then move on to a whole series of school-based data. So we have fee status, basically whether someone is a home student or not, the type of school that they're at, and our classification runs off our own school's database, where we still will describe things as sixth form colleges and comprehensive schools and grammar schools, even if they're now all called academies. So we have a sort of an indication of the sort of school it is in those terms. We give the average school A-level point score, the average GCSE score. So you get a sense of academically how strong is the environment where someone has done these qualifications. And then we give their GCSE profile. So although you see here number of A stars, really that should read number of A stars /8/9, which is our equivalency, and then we equate any 7s to an A, and then everything else is less than that. And as you can see, you know, this is our medicine field from a couple of years ago. These are very, very strong applicants with very, very strong profiles. But the thing that we then also do with this is to adjust the GCSE score depending on the strength of the GCSE school. So this person, for example, who is at a lower performing GCSE school, starts to have A's counted as A stars in that adjusted score, and then it's the adjusted GCSE score that we would use in any kinds of comparisons. We have another GCSE measure which tells us in that person's own GCSE cohort, were they in the top 20% or the top 60%? So we give them an A grading if they're in the top 20% of their GCSE school. And this enables us to take at least a bit of that unevenness out of the sort of the UK market in particular, because you can see, for example, that someone who has got 8 A stars from an extremely good GCSE school gets a lower rating than the person with 2 A stars from a worse GCSE school. And so it enables us to just sort of get a little bit more nuance into that GCSE data. So what we don't do is just say, oh, they haven't got 8 A stars, we're not going to do anything with them. We always contextualize that GCSE material in particular. And then the other thing you can see here is the admissions assessment scores. This is medicine, so this is the BMAT. And with our admissions assessment scores, we always keep all of the elements separate. So we don't kind of add everything up and then just use that. We always look for differential performance across those as well. So that's sort of what the data looks like when it's downloaded. When we're viewing it live, this is what we see on our applicant screens. This isn't real applicant data. This is from the sort of mock version. But what we've got here is a system where every admissions tutor or everybody who is, for example, a director of studies in a particular subject can see all of the applicants in that subject with their headline data. We can't, unless they're our own applicant, we can't click through to the files until they're put into something like the winter pool, but we can see the headline data. And if I were to click on this little thing over here, I would see the summary of all of that data that I could then download into the spreadsheet. So this is a live system. This is what gets updated on the way through the process. And it gets updated with things like interview scores and any at-interview assessment scores, any comments, what the college is thinking about with this person. You know, so here, for example, we've got someone who's a possible offer, someone who is definitely going into the pool, someone who's a reject. These don't actually make any sense against these scores. As I say, this is mock data here. Somebody with scores like this would almost definitely be an offer, for example, with very, very high interview scores. So this enables our admissions tutors to just keep an eye on what our decisions are in one college as opposed to what everybody else is doing across the field, and are there likely to be much stronger applicants at other colleges going into the pool. And you can see here that this is also where this contextual data gets flagged. So we can still pick up clusters of the markers, and we are particularly interested in these clusters. We have a couple of flags that we'll use as standalones. So the in-care flag and the free school meals flag we'll use as standalones. Those in and of themselves are important indicators. But for our other flags, we use them in combination. So where we have a cluster of them, we start to take them seriously. One flag alone of those others, particularly the postcode measures, doesn't necessarily trigger anything, but a cluster of flags, and we'll start to take these things much, much more seriously. So when you're producing your reference, highlighting areas of particular strength relative to the cohort is important. Relating back to the relevant subject selection criteria where it's possible is important. But particularly for this discussion, it's contextualizing achievement. So it's making clear that in the circumstances of your particular school, this is really remarkable, or this is a really, really strong student. So do remember to use the extenuating circumstances form. It's just a Qualtrics questionnaire that a teacher, that the referee or a GP or a social worker can fill in. It's really, really helpful if you get the candidate's data accurate on that, because it makes the matching much, much easier. And do remember that you can update us if something changes after the application has gone in. So you can just send an email to that person's admissions office if there is something that we need to know. Every year we do, for example, see bereavement shortly before interview, or serious illness or anything like that. It's really, really helpful for us to know about, just so we can take it into account and potentially be sensitive about it as well. So the other way in which, as well as assessing applications, our contextual flags bring with them eligibility for certain things. So probably the most important thing as far as your students are concerned is whether or not they then become eligible for what used to be called UCAS adjustment, but obviously adjustment is going now. So instead we are calling the August reconsideration pool at Cambridge. We're going to basically carry on using adjustment because it's been a real success for us. The students like it, and it really, really kind of enables us to open additional places up once we get through to the summer. So basically we would far, far rather take a student that we've turned down earlier in the year who then goes on to do really well at A-level, then we would, we'd much rather give them the place than give the place just because we do want to kind of admit a certain number of students every year, than to admit a student who's missed their A-level grades and who hasn't had any difficulties and was just a near miss. So we'd rather go back and reconsider the people that we originally turned down, who at that stage may not have looked quite so strong, but by the time they've got their A-levels do. So anyone who's been through our application process and we've turned down in January, if they are, if they have the in-care flag, or if they have been verified as eligible for free school meals, they are eligible to have another go in the summer. And similarly, if they meet 3 of the 5 contextual flags on the left, so any 3 of 5 of IMD, OAC, POLAR, post-16 education, so basically the low progression to Oxford and Cambridge flag, or a maintained sector school. So you will notice that the one flag we don't include on the left there is low performing GCSE school. And that is because we only have that data for England. We don't have it for the other UK nations. And so we didn't think we could have a marker that couldn't be equally applied across the UK. So that's why it's missing from that particular list. So that's, again, something to be aware of. Students who are eligible for this, where it's apparent and where it kind of is captured in our records, they're told that they're eligible in their decision communication in January. So you may already have some students who know that they might be eligible, and they can then come back on results day in August if there are spaces on the course. There aren't always spaces on the course, but I'm hopeful this summer, certainly, and next summer that there will be. We do have an appeals process. So we've had a little handful of cases this year, for example, people who were actually eligible for free school meals, but whose parents had never told them because they didn't want to kind of feel bad. And so sometimes people will approach us with the additional evidence that actually they do meet the criteria. And then, of course, we will reconsider and we will add them to the eligibility list if we do actually then verify that information. So that's one of the ways in which these contextual flags get used. The other ways are for both sort of pre-application support, but then also post-application support. So the pre-application support, we have a central scheme called Apply Cambridge, and this is for Year 12 students who are about to apply to Cambridge. There's about 500 places a year, and they are prioritised exactly against those the sorts of markers that I have just said. So when they apply for a place on the course, they give us their home postcode, their school name, and then we work out all of those contextual flags and whether they apply. So this is something that will give subject-specific support on elements of the admissions process, including things like admissions assessment preparation, interview workshops, mentoring from current undergraduates, and applications will be opening on in May on the website for a programme that then runs from July 2022 to January 2023. So if you've got suitable students that you would like to refer to that, please do make sure that they know about that. We also have a range of post-offer support, again, for students who meet these widening participation criteria, and that will include things like mentoring programs and also some tutoring support for specific subjects. But again, eligible students will be told and invited to apply for those kinds of support as well. And then the other thing I want to mention in relation to Cambridge is the foundation year. This is something that's taking up all my time this week because we're shortlisting for interview just at the moment. But this is something that is just starting. We're going to admit the first cohort in October. So applications for the October round have closed. We use the January UCAS deadline for this one. And again, we're using very, very similar sorts of markers, not identical though, because for the foundation year, we will take into account other things like educational disruption, severe health difficulties, a recent diagnosis of a specific learning difficulty, all those sorts of things as well. So the foundation year team, if you're also signed up to the main teachers conference, there's going to be a session there for the foundation year team, but there's also information on the website about eligibility criteria and how you might want to support students who are interested in applying for that course. And that's my rattle through, and I will stop sharing my screen so I can see faces and happily answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Sam, for that. Yeah, always good. Always good. Even someone who works, you know, in the system, it's always good to have that refresher. So yeah, good for me too. I just want to start with the first question, which came in about the August, about the summer pool. And will students be contacted automatically if there are spaces for them, or are they expected to get in contact with the college they've applied to?
No, we can't do that because that breaks UCAS rules. So we can't directly approach students to say, hey, would you like to come back and have a go? So we will update the web page the night before results with an indication of what courses are open. And so any courses that are open, those students, there will then be a very clear process for them to follow and a form for them basically to fill in.
Another one that's just come in on the chat, which is, can international schools provide contextual data so that they're able to have their data entered and their GCSE scores adjusted like UK students? And as a follow-up, is their fee status known by the tutors at the time of the interview?
Yeah, so no to the international schools. So you can trigger the low progression to Oxford and Cambridge flag, but it's worth saying that eligibility for all of our kind of outreach widening participation is limited to students who are UK domiciled. So often there is a sort of an implicit, but you know, you must be within the UK for that. So no to the GCSE score adjustment, which means that if you've got things to tell us about the relative academic GCSE performance of that person's school, it needs to go in your teacher's reference, and that's where we will then pick that up. Fee status, that the sort of Home Overseas EU is a provisional very, very kind of automated assessment that is done just based on what's been declared at UCAS. So colleges will always then verify fee status afterwards. The one subject where students might be asked to give us more detailed fee status information is medicine, because medicine is our one subject where there is any sort of control over the number of overseas places. And so you might find that any of your students who've applied for medicine are actually, particularly if you know, they have arrived in the UK within the last 11 years, for example, or it's not entirely clear that they are a UK citizen, those people might be asked to fill in a relatively detailed fee status questionnaire, because that is the one subject where it might make a real difference in terms of whether they will get an offer or not. The chances are, you know, basically the overseas medicine field is so competitive that unless you're right at the top of that field, you won't get an offer. So if you're someone who actually might be home, it's really worth us working out who is definitely home at that stage, because that puts them into the bigger pool with much more availability of places for those medics.
Yeah. And then another one, does Oxford have the same contextual flags?
Very similar. So I know that they use IMD, I think, and I know that they use Polar. They use, I think, Acorn rather than OAC. Everybody uses the in-care flag. They now have the free school meal data as supplied by UCAS, but they don't separately ask the question. So they might be missing a few people in their free school meals. Again, anyone where you know that kind of information, it's worth putting into your reference so that that's sort of automatic verification, if you like.
Yeah, good. And then this is another one. On the spreadsheet that you had up, on the master spreadsheet, there wasn't any predicted grades. I'm fairly sure that's just because the spreadsheet is so big that it's cut off. Yeah?
That's right. Yeah, I was just showing you the left-hand bit of it. No, there's many more columns in that, and one of the columns is the full printout of the UCAS prediction. So yeah, we do of course look at predicted grades, because you know, you are the people who know your students best. We've done quite a lot of work comparing predicted grades to outcomes. And so we know that everybody is over-predicted, but to a relatively predictable degree, if you like. So no, we're pretty good at assessing the information that we're getting from predictions as well.
Okay, and then sorry, that's just covered off, I think, that
Mm-hmm.
one. Sorry, bear with me as it's poor moderating from me. So yeah, a question about how much emphasis do we place on GCSE results, particularly probably, and this is relation to, with us no longer having the AS levels for the majority of the UK, have we started to look at GCSEs or put more emphasis on GCSEs now?
So we don't use them in any kind of hard or fast ways, but we do use them in contextual ways. So we have, for example, a couple of subjects where we know from tracking past cohorts that somebody with, less than 3 A stars, for example, is probably not going to be a realistic candidate. So we have that sort of thinking factored into our decision making, but as I say, we will always make an exception for someone who's got severe extenuating circumstances, so it's never done in that kind of formulaic way, but we do have some sort of general guidance in terms of what's a strong GCSE performance. And of course, even with the sort of contextualization for the strongly performing schools, 9, 10 A stars is still 9, 10 A stars. And even if that means they're in the top 40% of their school, that's still a very good performance. So, it's not going to be kind of used against somebody. So really it's about making sure you're evaluating the lower end of apparent performance fairly in terms of the context where that was generated.
Yeah, and I would just add as well, and hopefully Sam will nod along to what I'm saying. I think we definitely look for sort of poor performance in a relevant GCSE subject.
Mm-hmm.
So, if someone's applying for a STEM degree or STEM subject, I should say, and they've got a 6 in GCSE maths, then there would be some question marks being raised over that application.
Yeah. Similarly, if sort of, you can see different sorts of profiles. So someone who's very much on the STEM side, perhaps didn't have English as a first language, might only have 5s in the 2 Englishes, but has got 9s in, maths, physics, biology, and chemistry. That's fine. That's going to be a strong support for a good STEM application. So we do look at these things kind of carefully and make those individualized judgments.
Yeah. And then a question about just going back to the work on predictions versus outcomes. Has that been done for individual schools, or is it just sort of the aggregate of all predictions and all outcomes?
It's a big data set that we can break down by individual school types, which is quite helpful. And there, obviously in the last couple of cycles, there's been sector-wide analysis done of where particular grade inflation was seen and where the difference was between summer 20 and summer 2021, for example. So we have a pretty good idea of where the inflation has come from, in what sorts of subjects, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I should also probably say as well that one of the strengths of the Cambridge admissions process is the fact that there are lots of eyes on every application. We do our best to treat every application holistically. So, there's lots of people looking at all of these, and, if someone in the office has not possibly caught something, there's someone else in the office who's going to catch it as well to make sure that we treat each application fairly. This is another question about the other place, Oxford, which we shouldn't really talk about. But do you know if Oxford have a similar approach, and also do they have their own version of adjustment? This teacher was disappointed that UCAS scrapped this, but is glad to know that Cambridge has their own scheme to replace it.
I am not entirely sure. So, they certainly have a similar approach to contextualization. They might use different sorts of measures, but I know that they're kind of, trying to reach the same aims as us, which is to fairly contextualize the applications that they get. I'm not sure where they got to on the adjustment discussions. I did go and give them a presentation about how we did it, and I had lots and lots of questions, but I don't know where discussions have got to after that. So I think it's a question of wait and see. I'm not even sure that they've decided yes or no yet.
Okay, I think that's. Has anyone else got any other questions for Sam or myself?
So there is a question there I can see about whether individual schools have a reputation for
Oh,
historic
yes.
under over predicting, not to that level of detail, no. It is more of a sort of a school patterns in school type that we see, and that we've certainly seen over the past couple of years.
Great. Any more for any? Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So this is, I think, a more broader question, which is, at what stage do you think, as in a student's university career, will early stage disadvantages be eliminated?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it's an impossible one to answer. So, somebody who perhaps was adopted as a baby into a perfectly advantaged household and has been sent to excellent schools, I think it's probably been remedied relatively early on. People who've kind of, spent the first 7 years in extreme poverty, I'm not sure you ever really recover from that. So I think it really, really depends on those individual circumstances. I don't actually think there's a straightforward answer to that one.
Yeah. And I would possibly chip in at a college level. The academic support networks available within every college at Cambridge means that, if a student, for whatever reason, is struggling with, well, usually for the workload, it's suddenly it's an intense working environment. There's a lot of academic support available for them whilst they're at college, which, helps them sort of achieve their potential or to minimize any disadvantages they have before they've come up to college. And also, as Sam talked about, there's a lot of support available centrally and at college level for offer holders, so to make sure that those who come from the most disadvantaged backgrounds don't miss their offers because of their educational situation.
Yeah, and I guess the other aspect to talk about here is financial support as well. So, the presence of things like the Cambridge Bursary Scheme, and the new Cambridge Bursary Scheme that we have now for students who arrive this year and subsequently, if someone's been entitled to free school meals while they've been at school, they have an enhanced Cambridge Bursary, so they have an extra £1,000 on top of the £3,500 a year. So, actually, we find that some of our students from the poorest backgrounds end up having, bizarrely, the most available resources because they are entitled to this extra level of support on top of what they can get from government. So I think one of the things that makes a big difference to participation and sort of getting on at Cambridge is whether you're actually having to worry about money all of the time. And it's probably true for any university. So, what we try to aim is that we support students financially so that they don't have to have part-time jobs, particularly during term time, because that we know has a detrimental impact on people's academic performance if they're trying to do sort of two things at once. So I think the financial support is a really key part of making sure that students perform academically, which doesn't kind of, you don't think of that straight away, but actually it's really, really important.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Sam. Do we have any other questions at all? Otherwise, I'm happy to let you've all had a long day, so I'm happy to let you all go and probably face a pile of marking. But if anyone else have any other questions for Sam or myself, give it a moment for the cogs to go. No, I think that's all. So I just want to say thank you very much, Sam, for giving up your time today. And thank you for everyone else who attended and asked questions or just listened. If anyone has any follow-up questions, as you're eating dinner tonight or laying in bed, and you think, why didn't I ask it? Please just email me. And if I can't answer it, I'll forward it on to Sam, who I'm sure if she's got time between doing the many, 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 many things that she has to do,